It's common to hear educators talk about how important it is to teach students to think critically, that rather than just teaching them what to think, they should be taught how to think. Unfortunately, when it comes to evolution, most students are just being taught what to think. In fact, the general public is being bombarded with messages about what to think about evolution. Well, I want to recommend a book. I think it's the best book on the subject, and it will help you or help your students think critically about evolution. It's called The Scientific Approach to Evolution by Rob Stadler. Rob Stadler has a PhD in medical engineering. He's been doing experimental science for more than 19 years. This book is great because it teaches you how to think critically about scientific data and how to evaluate the evidence that is presented for evolution. And that's important because you have people like Richard Dawkins saying that evolution is a scientific fact, but then when he's asked to give the evidence for that, he supplies examples of very low confidence science. For example,
the evidence that makes it a fact is partly fossil evidence, partly comparative evidence, looking at modern species and comparing their bones, their organs, their structures generally, and especially their molecules, their genes at a molecular level.
So according to Richard Dawkins, the two things that supply the greatest evidence for evolution are the fossil record and homology, comparing similar structures within organisms. Let's look at what Dr. Stadler has to say about the fossil record. He says, although we can make objective statements about fossils, where they were found, how deep, how large, how heavy, any claims about how the fossilized life forms came to exist are inherently subjective because we have no hope of repeating the process, no direct measurements of the process that created them, and no hope of establishing causality. So, according to Dr. Stadler, the fossil record does not supply us with evidence for evolution that we can put a high degree of confidence in because it violates several of the criteria for high confidence science, which are, number one, it has to be repeatable. Number two, it has to be directly measurable and give accurate results. Number three, it has to include prospective interventional study. Number four is that it has to be careful to avoid bias. Number five, careful to avoid assumptions. Number six, it has to have sober judgment of the results. And looking at the fossil record and assuming that evolution happened, really, is that being careful to avoid assumptions? We don't know how these fossils formed. Let's see what Dr. Stadler has to say about homology. The commonly cited examples of homology are carefully selected to support the argument of common ancestry. There are many striking examples that speak to the lack of homology between life forms. Going on, he says, selecting only the evidence that supports common ancestry and ignoring the evidence against it is a type of bias, the fourth criterion of low confidence science. So when Richard Dawkins says that the similar structures in organisms supply the best evidence for evolution, he is using carefully selected examples and ignoring all the examples of structures that are not similar and that do not lend well to the idea of a common ancestor and therefore evolution. In addition to that, just comparing the structures, similar structures within organisms, does not tell us anything about how those organisms were formed, unless we start with the assumption that evolution happened. And that's the problem that many are working with today. They're starting from the assumption that evolution happened and then interpreting everything in light of that assumption. Another reason that comparing structures is not a good example of science that we can be confident in is that there's no experimental evidence. There's nothing repeatable. There's nothing about the process of development that we can repeat and that we can directly observe. We cannot observe how these life forms were formed. So we can't know their origin just by seeing that they are similar. So the two greatest evidences that Richard Dawkins supplied are not good evidences at all. So again, I want to recommend this scientific approach to evolution. And if you're someone who is inclined to believe in evolution, well, I think you'll get a lot out of this book. Rob Stadler is very fair in his evaluation of the evidences supplied for evolution. And he does have a chapter called High Confidence Evidence for Evolution, where he talks about some of the better evidences that are supplied for evolution. So you will like this book, you'll learn a lot from it, and it's very readable too. It's not boring at all. It's something that I think everyone can get something out of, and that students should be required to read. It's that good. So thanks for watching this video, and if you hated it, then give it a dislike and tell me what you hated about it in the comments section. Thanks.